Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to GSIS. Just before this session, I'd like to say a few words about some background of this today's event. This event is organized by Professor Valenta, who is AKF visiting fellow, Australia visiting fellow at GSIS in New, which was just launched this year, with generous support from the Australia Korea Foundation. And so the whole purpose of this project is that try to strengthen the partnership between Australia and Korea, in particular having Australian experts at the Seoul National University so that they can introduce various aspects of Australian study and program. And Professor Valenta is the first scholar visiting professor at GSIS in New. And she has been already very active in promoting the programs and some aspects of Australian society. But in particular this time, she also invited K.Lee under this topic of U.S. alliances, Australia's Indo-Pacific and U.S. alliance strategy. This is also, I believe, as also students of international security myself, is a very important and pertinent topic for now. And also, given the election going on at the moment in Korean society, also we can maybe prepare some note what just happened in the Australian election, which also have some important implication for not only for Korea or Australia's security policy, but also geopolitical implication under this rapid changing geopolitical situation, not only in the Pacific, but also in other parts of the world. So I'm extremely happy and very much look forward to today's presentation and topic. And we have, I believe, excellent speaker who will be introduced by Professor Valenta. So please welcome Professor Valenta.
Thanks very much, Professor Shin. So as Professor Shin has just mentioned, the Visiting Fellowship in Australian Studies here is a program that's been sort of overseen by the Australia-Korea Foundation. So that's an Australian government body that is dedicated to widening and deepening knowledge, public awareness of Australia and Korea and vice versa, and encouraging partnerships between the two countries. So that's why I'm here. And next semester, I'll be teaching, as a number of you know actually, an interdisciplinary introduction to Australian studies that draws on my own expertise as an historian, but thinks about politics, thinks about culture, and thinks about history. And what I'm calling the strategic imagination, thinking kind of broadly about issues that relate to security and to strategy for Australia. I'll also be organising a symposium which is thinking about art and commemorative practices involving Australia and Korean scholars. So there'll be more information that will come through about that the next semester. But right now, one of the things that I was aware of after coming here to the Institute for International Affairs and the Graduate School of International Studies was that a lot of what's done here, rightly, at SNU when you're thinking about security issues, is very much focused on the East Asian context. And so, as the visiting professor of Australian Studies, I really wanted to kind of bring Australia into that conversation. Conscious, of course, that in this current environment in which we find ourselves of increasing strategic insecurity and instability or uncertainty, that there are cooperation and dialogue between a range of partners and of US allies as well as increasingly important. So I've asked Dr. K.Lee to come and talk about Australia's management of its all of its strategic alliances and thinking today. And he's incredibly well qualified to do this. So Dr. K.Lee, I'll just introduce you now, Peter, is a research fellow at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. He's based in the Centre for Regional Studies there. And he's also a board member of the Australia-Korea Foundation, and previously has been a Korea Foundation fellow at the Asia Institute at the University of Melbourne. So he's got kind of deep knowledge of both the Australian and Korean aspects. He actually did his PhD in strategic studies at the Australian National University, looking at middle power cooperation on security and focusing on the Australian-Korean relationship. So he's got deep expertise that he will be drawing on now. And Peter, I'll hand over to you to talk to us about Australia's Indo-Pacific and U.S. alliance strategies.
Thank you. So thank you everyone for coming today for this talk. So as Professor Balanta mentioned, my name is Dr. K.Lee. This way I'm not sort of stuck at the podium for the presentation. But I guess very briefly, so I've been in Korea for about a year and a half now. And before that, I was at the University of Sydney and the Australian National University. And most of my work the last few years has looked at Australia-US relations. So AUKUS, force posture, a lot of those questions. And so I'm really delighted to be here in Seoul to talk about introducing Australia to you. I think a lot of you will wonder, why am I learning about Australia when I'm sitting in Korea? And my argument would be, it's actually all connected now. The world is becoming much smaller, and US alliances in North Asia and in the Pacific are really integrating in a fundamentally exciting and unprecedented way. And so the time has come, I think, for Koreans, for people who study Korea, to learn about what's happening in other US alliances. Very much happening in Australia as well. People are learning about Korea and Japan and how these other alliances are working. So really the thrust of my presentation today will be about how Australia engages the world and where I think Korea fits into that, and also what Korea might learn from that experience. So before I begin, I want to thank Professor Shin, Professor Balanta, also Woodside, and the Australia-Korea Foundation for making this possible. So when I heard that I was going to do this seminar today, I thought, wow, there'd be so many people interested in Australia. I just knew. And then I realized there was free lunch. So maybe it's the free lunch, but come for the lunch, stay for the lecture is probably the better way to think about this. So what I'm going to do today is 4 things, hopefully, so that you go away from this sort of brief hour that we have together with 4 really interesting new ideas about Australia. The first is, what is Australia? What kind of country is it? What does it fear? How does it sit in the world? Second, it's how does Australia approach the region and the world? What kind of order, what kind of world is Australia trying to make? And how does the United States and the alliance with the United States fit within that story? Third, it's how does Australia actually do policy? How does Australia do defense strategy? How do we engage the region? And I guess how might Korea take some lessons from that? Finally, I'm going to discuss some of the big dilemmas that Australia is currently grappling with as a country. Can you see the bottom of the slide? Sorry. Okay, hopefully. And really what I call the Bandicoot dilemma, which is how does a small, non-great power deal with this very uncertain and changing international environment? So those are the 4 things that hopefully you'll take away from my presentation today. So first, for most of you, I think you probably never had a course on Australian foreign policy, Australian defense policy, Australia's way of the world. You probably had 50 classes on Korea. So this is the really short version of what you would do if you were a student at ANU or University of Sydney, right? There are 2 different stories about Australia. So there is a story that I think a lot of Koreans are probably more familiar with, which is modern Australia from the 19th and 20th centuries, a white Australia, a colonial Australia. I think there's important to remember that there is a story that goes much further back, right? So the settlement of Australia began about 60 to 70,000 years ago. And really what Australians are taught when we grow up is the story of how Indigenous Australians settled Australia, how they lived in Australia for tens of thousands of years, essentially in harmony in many ways. So this is a rock art from about 30,000 years ago. It's in the sort of northern part of Australia and tells the story of the rainbow serpent, and the dreaming and the creation of Australia and the world. I want to show you this to remind you that there could have been a different Australia. There could have been a different Australia with a different foreign policy, a different national identity, and that is really a key question that Australians, even today, are grappling with. What kind of country are we? What kind of country will we become? For Koreans, that's a much simpler story. Korea is the story of the Joseon Kingdom, right? It's the heir to that story, and it's the unfulfilled story of unification. For Australia, it's a bit more complicated, I think, in that sense. So this is just a great sort of piece of art from the 1970s. And it's this period where Australia is grappling with what kind of country are we? How do we embrace and reimagine our Indigenous heritage in Australia? So in one slide, to give you sort of an entire semester's worth of lessons in one slide, it's 60,000 years of continuing civilization on one continent. And the idea of the continent we'll come back to in a second. So in the 1600s, European explorers, the Dutch and others, first sort of encounter Australia, this idea of what they call Terra Australis, so the Great Southern Land. And it's in the sort of 1780s that the British eventually claim Australia before the Dutch and other people get there. Through most of the 19th century, Australia has this process of northern and westward expansion, much like in the United States. Eventually colonizing the entire continent. So there didn't end up being a Canada or a Mexico on the Australian continent. It became one British colony. In 1901, these different colonies united to form the Commonwealth of Australia. So in the 1940s, around the time of the Second World War, we begin this period of non-British migration. So until about 1940, 98% of the Australian population are essentially of British heritage. So not even French or Dutch or Swedish, they're all British from the British Isles. So this is when we see, for instance, Swedes and Estonians and other people from continental Europe begin to arrive. It's in the 60s that Australia has a fundamental, shift in its relations with the world, where our trade with the British and the United Kingdom is finally overtaken by trade with Japan and eventually Southeast Asia. This is also when sort of non-white migration begins in Australia and the end of the White Australia policy. I think a really important turning point is in 1999, Australia has a referendum to decide what kind of country will we become? Will we stay a part of the Commonwealth, like Canada or other countries, or do we become a republic, like the United States? Eventually, the referendum is defeated and Australia remains a part of the Commonwealth. So to understand, how Australia engages the world, it's useful to reflect on, the classic iconography, the fears that have haunted Australia for all of its 240 years of British settlement, right? So in the 19th century, it was fears of sort of Chinese and Asian migration during the gold rush era. In the sort of early 20th century, it was European colonial encroachment into the Pacific Islands. So for instance, the Germans took over colonies in the Pacific Islands. In the 1920s and 30s, it was the Japanese invasions into the Pacific and Southeast Asia. During the Cold War, it was the threat of communist sort of expansion. And most recently in Australia, it's this idea of, Red China, the coming conflict with the US and China that Australia is now grappling with. So that very brief sort of 3-minute overview, tells you a bit about the very different journeys that Australia and Korea have been on. And as someone who studies both countries very intimately, the history and the different historical journeys of the 20th century tell you a lot about how these countries behave today, how they take risks, how they take partnerships, really how they think about the world, right? So if you think about, for instance, in the 1950s, right, Korea is coming out of this period of enormous political, domestic upheaval, the Korean War. Australia finds the Korean War within a different story, within the story of forward defense, of anti-communism, of sending soldiers abroad to fight, right? If you go to the 1970s, after the Vietnam War, both countries deal with this question of American abandonment, but they really, respond to that quite differently, right? So Korea pursues independence, self-sufficiency, nuclear weapons, an independent foreign policy. Australia during this period really seeks to engage the United States and bring it closer in. In the sort of post-Cold War era, again, we see both countries dealing with the same big systemic international issues and yet responding in quite different ways. So from a security and defense standpoint, this is really the first engagement between Australia and Korea. It sort of sets the tone for how our two countries deal with each other. And so this is a famous photo from the Korean War when Australian paratroopers were actually fighting in Kapyong. Has anyone been to Kapyong? Okay, so it's about an hour sort of east of Seoul. It's sort of wonderful mountain resorts and relaxing. But so this is some of the fiercest fighting during the Korean War, holding back a Chinese and North Korean advance. Right? And so even today, every year, sort of in April, Australian, Canadian, and Kiwi, New Zealand diplomats, they go to Kapyong to commemorate the Australian, Canadian, and Kiwi forces there. So in that sense, I think Australia's imagination of Korea was quite different to how Korea sees Australia as part of, I think for many Koreans, part of this Commonwealth or Five Eyes or Anglospheric sort of world, right? So if that's the story, if that's the past, then what is Australia today? In the year 2025, Professor Shin mentioned we had just had an election. I couldn't find a photo of the new cabinet, so this is the previous cabinet, but most of the sort of ministers are still the same. For a country that had that history, that had that heritage of colonial settlement, of white Australia and Indigenous Australia. In 2025, we have a Prime Minister of Italian heritage, we have a Foreign Minister of mixed Chinese Malaysian heritage, we have ministers from Irish heritage, Indigenous Australians, and so forth, and many women as well. So the country has changed remarkably in about 200 years, even 50 years, I think. So for a Korean sort of comparison, Australia is about half the size of Korea. So it's about 27 million people, but it's 50 times larger than South Korea. So you can fit 50 South Koreas into Australia. So it's that question of, it's a very large economy, primarily driven by mineral exports, coal, iron ore, and so forth. But it's a very highly urbanized country. So in that sense, it's very similar to Korea. So most of the Australian population lives in about 3 cities, right? Despite those 27 million people. And I guess the focus of my remarks today is around security. So it's actually for a country with a similar GDP to Korea, it spends only about $10 billion less than South Korea does. And Australia doesn't have a North Korea threatening to invade it with nuclear weapons. It's a relatively peaceful region, right? Indonesia, penguins, 2 oceans on either side. And yet we spend close to $40 billion a year on defense. So that's the puzzle that I want to sort of answer today with you. Why does a country that is relatively peaceful spend so much on security? So I won't go into these questions, but hopefully Professor Balanta, during her time here with you at SNU in the next few months, will really grapple with these, what I think are the 2 big questions Australia is grappling with as a country, right? How do we reconcile that history as a British Anglo-Celtic country with our proximity to Asia? One of our former prime ministers used to say, do we seek security from Asia? Do we seek security in Asia or with Asia? What are we, right? Is Australia, to use another example, for a long time Australia in football, so soccer, we used to play in the Oceania Football Federation, so with New Zealand and Fiji. About 10 years ago, Australia said, we're actually part of Asia, so we went and joined the AFC to play with Korea and other countries. But at the same time, Australia goes to Eurovision and sends delegates to sing with Europeans. So it's a country that has many different identities, I think. And what that answer is determines a lot. The second part is it's a more long-running debate about whether we stay a part of the British colonial family, the Commonwealth, or whether we strike an independent path, whether we become a republic, a separate country. So the current government, they had actually promised in their last term in government that if they had won again, that they would have another referendum to become a republic. So that very quick, I guess, overview in about 10 minutes of what kind of country is. Hopefully it tells you something different between what you thought about 5-10 minutes ago. But I think that needs the context for the real sort of focus of my remarks today, which is what is Australia trying to do and where does the United States and the region fit into that story? So if you look at our sort of strategic documents, foreign policy white papers, it's actually quite simple, right? Australia wants a region of prosperity to ensure and defend that prosperity. We want to make sure that there is a region where power does not make the rules, right? That the rules govern power. Because as a country that is very small, 27 million people, we can't live in a world where great powers can do what they want. So those are the two, I guess, driving principles that Australian foreign policy is guided by. And to defend that, I think, governments at different times, conservative and progressive, they use different terminology to encapsulate that same idea. So some governments talk about rules-based international order, others talk about a world order that favors freedom, so a bit more values-based. Some talk about a free and open Indo-Pacific. The current government, so our foreign minister right now, she talks a lot about a strategic equilibrium. So there is no values or democracy in this. It's really about a balance of power. And our current defense minister talks about a favorable balance of power in which countries are not tempted to use force. So to uphold those values, that kind of order, Australia has contributed a great deal to issues and conflicts that actually don't really matter in a direct national interest component, right? Things that happen far away, Australia participates and contributes to because it's driven by this, I guess, grander principle, right? Beyond just territorial defense, right? So to uphold this kind of world, Australia sent 80,000 soldiers as peacekeepers around the world, right? And it's been involved in many, many conflicts far from Australia. So if that's the world that Australia wants, then what is the region that Australia wants? And so if you think about our region, I'm sure you've all taken Professor Shin's class on IR theory and so forth. I would still say that our region is fundamentally hierarchical. It's not an anarchical society. There is a hierarchy of power within our region. And so this is just an image from the Lowy Institute in Australia, which is a think tank. And they produce an annual power index. And if you look at it, Australia sort of sits about in the middle, right? It's behind the great powers. But when you compose all different metrics of national power, economic, defense, and so forth. My point would be that we've enjoyed a sort of privileged upper tier status for most of Australia's history. And this status, this upper tier status, is very slowly being eroded. And this is a key driving question for Australian policymakers. So if you think back 30 years ago, Australia's defense budget was actually all of ASEAN countries combined. We spent more on defense. 30 years later, countries like Vietnam, Philippines, and Singapore are rapidly increasing defense budgets. So that edge, that upper tier status is slowly being eroded for Australia. So when we think about the region, so for Korean policymakers, the map of the region looks very different to how Australians imagine our region. And so my sort of joke before about penguins, it's actually, well, the penguins are actually in our map, right? So we always have Antarctica in our map as our sort of core strategic region of interest. So this is from about 40 years ago, 1986, a famous defense white paper, which sketched out how we would defend Australia from incoming threats. Right? And so you see sort of the Indian Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, in that sort of concentric circle. 2 years ago, not much has changed. This is from the 2023 Defense Strategic Review, which was an independent review of our defense force. And really, it's the same map, just tilted a bit, right? But it's a different way to look at the world than I guess we're used to if you're sitting in Korea. So within that region, within that world, what actually are we trying to defend in a more territorial sense? So this is just a map of all of our minerals and resources in Australia. And what you can see is that the population lives on this side, and all of our wealth is on this side. And so this creates a conundrum for Australian policymakers. How do we defend this while we all live over here, right? And who would actually come to get that anyway? So this is another sort of creative map which showed where if you take out where people really don't live in Australia, essentially the country is a very long archipelago with Perth and WA over here. So within this sort of blue ocean, there's about 100,000 people, right? So in all of that size, there are very few people that actually live in Australia. So defending Australia, which is sort of the key question. How do you defend the region, defend the world? This is from our recent Defence National Strategy, which sets out sort of 5 key tasks for the Australian Defence Force, the Australian government to take. I think essentially the first 2 are the most important, right? How do you defend the country and defend access into that country? So quite recently, about a month ago, 2 PLA navies, so Chinese Navy ships, they circumnavigated Australia. So they went down, they went past New Zealand, they sort of went all the way back up. And so it was basically front page news for a whole week. You know, the whole country was watching these 2 Navy ships going around Australia because first, we didn't know that they were there. So that was a huge sort of, I guess, shock for Australian media. But also that, you know, there was nothing we could do about this Chinese Navy. And so this is the first time the PLA Navy had ever visited, you know, down here in Tasmania and the southern part of Australia. So I think Australia realizes that the world is changing very, very quickly. Australia has tried to pursue different strategies over the last sort of 240 years. And so right now we're trying to think which is the best one. In the colonial era, in the 19th century, it was essentially, because we didn't have many people, to send soldiers abroad in service of imperial, i.e. British support. There were times when Australia looked at expanding its own colonial empire into the Papua New Guinea, into parts of the Pacific Islands. There were times in the Cold War where we fought in Korea and Vietnam and Malaysia and elsewhere to defend this sort of anti-communist struggle. In the end of the Cold War era, they grappled with this question of how do we do self-reliant defense? So in Korean, we would call it sort of 자주국방. It takes a very different view in Australia. Continental defense, federation with other countries, absorbing New Zealand, for instance, has always been an interesting idea for some people in Australia. Or integration with Asia, right? Finding security as part of ASEAN, joining a Pacific Islands forum or a Pacific Islands family, and that's that idea of integration, safety, and numbers. So there are many different ways that a country like Australia or a non-great power can pursue its interests in a disorderly world. Just, I guess, for a Korean audience or for an audience who is based in Korea, how do we actually defend a country as large as Australia, 50 times larger than South Korea, right? So this is just a very small part of northern Australia, so the northern part, and this is the Indonesian archipelago, Papua New Guinea, right? So how would you defend a country that large from Australia, right? That's the entire Korean peninsula for scale, right? So you have to have all of this defended across here, but at night you can see there's nobody north of Australia. This is the city of Darwin, which is about 200,000 people. This is sort of Jakarta and Java. But essentially, how do you defend a landmass that large, many times the size of South Korea? So this is, I think, the question that keeps Australian policymakers up at night. It's why we didn't see 2 Chinese Navy ships turn up, because how do you defend an area that large? So I guess because we are at a university, for an IR sort of puzzle then, why does a country that's prosperous, far away from potential threats, we have penguins, we have oceans, we have great wealth, no one, the Indonesians are not threatening us, and why do we then invest so heavily in the United States, in the alliance, in upholding this international order? So this is, I guess, a question that you can have your own answer to. So for some in Australia, it's quite simple. It's a constructivist argument around identity, around heritage, around race, around the shared sort of Anglosphere, the Five Eyes kind of interpretation of the world. For others who are more realist, I guess, in attitudes, it's about balancing, it's about potential threats, not real or existent. It's about the rise of Southeast Asia and what that means in the long term. If you're an institutionalist, it's about trade. It's about institutions. It's about the dependence on sea lines of communication and trade, and why Australia needs sort of a dominant, a liberal leviathan, if you were to use Eikenberry's term. And so that's sort of international order. Whichever answer you choose, or it could be a combination of the two, it takes you down different routes of how then you would engage the United States, I think. So sort of the next part of my conversation today is, I guess I want to give you 3 examples of what all of this sort of abstract, sort of conceptual discussion looks like in a very pragmatic and policy area, which is sort of where I work on. So I'm going to talk a little bit about force posture, a little bit about shipbuilding, and a little bit about nuclear deterrence. So how does Australia do strategy given that historical context? This is a photo from 2021. It's one of my favorite photos. It's an American Air Force Osprey aircraft, which is training with Australian soldiers up in the Northern Territory of Australia. And over the last about 14 years or so, the US military presence in Australia has skyrocketed. It has completely transformed Australia in many ways, and yet it's probably one of the least understood, least reported transformations in our alliance with the United States. So all through Australia's history, since the Cold War, there's been a bipartisan position in Australian governments that there will never be foreign bases in Australian soil. So this has been reiterated in every foreign policy white paper, in defense white papers, and even when Australia signed a visiting forces agreement with the United States. We stipulated very much at the start there will never be a foreign base in Australia. So if you believe that as a headline argument, it creates some puzzles though. The first is, there are thousands of Singaporeans who train every year in Australia. Since the 1990s, the Singaporean Defence Force has had long-term leasing agreements in Northern Australia, because if you're a small country like Singapore, right, you don't have a lot of space to train. So they've leased an area about 10 times the size of Seoul to conduct independent military training every year, right? So essentially Australia has provided access for Singaporean forces. I've always wondered, is that a base? If you have a 25-year lease agreement to use that land as you want, is that a base or not? So in 2011, Australia signed an agreement with the United States during the Obama period to begin what we call rotational deployments of US Marines to Northern Australia, to that white dot on the map before. And so these Marines, about 2,500, they come every year during what we call the dry season, so when it's not raining, and they conduct training exercises with Australian forces, they invite Indonesian and Papua New Guinea soldiers and Singaporeans to train. In 2 years' time, as part of the AUKUS partnership, US and UK submarines will be forward deployed in Australia. And so there will be potentially up to 4 US and 1 British submarine, essentially rotationally deployed through Australia. So we become a submarine base in some ways. How does that square with that argument? There are no foreign bases in Australia and there never will be. This is a very unique, I think, Australian approach to defense security cooperation. At the same time, Australian military personnel and assets are widely deployed in the region in a way that I think for many Korean experts would be quite surprising. So there have been Australian military personnel here in Korea for the better part of 50 years, right? They help patrol the DMZ as part of Operation Lionsman. They are based at Pyeongtaek with the UN command. In previous years, an Australian Navy officer used to be the deputy commander of the UNC. So the commander of the USFK is the head of UNC, but the deputy commander has been an Australian. If you go to Hawaii, the deputy commanding general of the US Army Pacific is an Australian who is posted into the US military. So there are very deep force sort of exchanges that go on between the Australian military and its allies and partners in the region, right? So there is Australian in the New Zealand Army, New Zealand soldiers in the Australian Army, for instance. Australian submarines have American sailors, American submarines have Australian sailors. There's a wide degree of integration, which raises the question, right, of how this squares with the question of sovereignty. So that's the first example. The second is AUKUS. Has anyone here not heard of AUKUS? Okay. So this is in 2023 when President Biden announced what we call the optimal pathway. So they did this in, I think, San Diego, where they announced that Australia would acquire or buy 3 American nuclear attack submarines in the next sort of 6-7 years, and then we would then build a fleet of 5 more. The shipbuilding is another really puzzling, I think, approach to Australia. So when we define defense sovereignty, sovereign industrial capabilities, these differ quite a lot from how Korea defines it. So in the Korean system generally, defense self-reliance is understood as the pursuit of self-sufficiency, to increase the domestic content quotas in how Korea produces capabilities, eventually ultimately seeking 100% Korean ownership, Korean IP, Korean capabilities, Korean production. Australia has tended to instead define it based around the idea of, can we control it? Can we use it when we want it? If so, we don't really mind where it comes from. So the naval shipbuilding enterprise is quite illustrative of this. For instance, if you look at warships, for most of our history, we've bought or partnered or co-produced warships with British, French, German, Spanish, and other countries. Right now, we have a tender for either a Japanese or a German frigate, for instance, which could have been a Korean frigate as well. When it comes to submarines, pretty much all of our submarines have always been built with foreign countries, right? So with the British in the 1960s, the Swedish, so Kockums in the 1990s, and for the 2010s, it was sort of Japan, then potentially France, and now the UK and the US. So this is, I guess, the story of a country that takes a very different approach to defense sovereignty, to defense industrial capabilities. So my argument has always been that AUKUS is actually not that surprising. It's the logical conclusion to this journey that Australia's been on for many, many years, to take the two most trusted allies of Australia, the US and the UK, and to build the most capable quality submarine possible. I guess the puzzle, the and yet bit, is despite this, we have made continuous naval shipbuilding, so doing this in Australia, a key national sovereign industrial capability. So that's example 2. The third one, and sort of this will be the final part of my presentation, is nuclear deterrence. So the image on the left is from Pine Gap, which is now a strange TV show, but it sits literally in the middle of Australia. So if you look at the map here, it's literally at the heart of Australia, and it's a joint Australia-US intelligence signals collection facility. And it was set up during the Cold War to basically monitor Soviet missile launches, because this is sort of the closest the Americans could get. And so if they could detect a Soviet missile launch from Eurasia, this would be sort of the trigger for World War, right? On the left side there it's a little city called Exmouth on the northwest Cape of Australia. And this was to monitor Soviet ballistic missile submarines, sort of cruising in the Indian Ocean through the Straits of Malacca and so forth. What Australian researchers discovered many years later was that in Soviet nuclear planning, both of these sites had already been targeted in the event of a nuclear war. So Australia was very much front and center of any Soviet-US nuclear conflict. And yet, despite all of that, Australia has never had nuclear weapons, never hosted nuclear weapons, and even compared to Japan and South Korea, which both did host tactical nuclear weapons during the Cold War, Australia has never had sort of very concrete extended nuclear deterrence commitments, despite being in the front lines of a potential global nuclear conflict. Moreover, Australia is one of the world's largest exporters of uranium. If it wanted to, it could produce nuclear power quite easily. It's been a strong topic of public debate for many years, and yet the country has a very deep anti-nuclear sentiment. And yet this is the country that's now going to produce a fleet of nuclear-powered submarines. So, and then I guess one final point to add to that is, I guess for a Korean security question point. So if you look at Korea-US alliance extended deterrence debates, quite a lot of the focus is on how Korea can have more visible and more tangible US extended nuclear deterrence commitments. So more regular visits by US submarines, more regular flyovers by US long-range bombers and so forth. This has happened in the Australian case very quietly without anybody really noticing. So for instance, US B-52 bombers have begun landing in Australia. The US nuclear attack submarines will begin being deployed in Australia. Australia is building silos in northern Australia to be a refueling depot for US long-range bombers. So a lot of things that Korea or Japan would want in terms of a nuclear security commitment are happening in Australia with very few people having asked for this in the first place. That, I guess, is also a puzzle. So I guess to conclude, this very cute little animal in Australia is called a bandicoot. So it's about sort of this small. But what we call the bandicoot dilemma is, how does a very small, cute animal like that survive in a very hostile, dangerous Australian outback environment, where lots of animals are trying to kill it, right? So how much of what I have said to you today about the Australian experience is actually uniquely Australian that cannot be compared or replicated anywhere? Or how much of it is actually quite similar? So if you're an IR sort of scholar, you'd say there are lots of similarities. Right? There are lots of parallels as middle powers, as non-great powers, and so forth. So I guess to conclude, on the unique side, I think it's very clear that there are unique historical, demographic, geographical, economic features of Australia's journey that simply cannot be replicated anywhere, that are very unique to the Australian experience. It's what makes Australia different, I think, to New Zealand in many ways. They're both quite similar countries, or Canada, quite similar countries. Because of that, I guess, sort of journey that Australia has come through, it has a very unique approach to the alliance and to the region. And I think my sort of conclusion would be that it's a much more flexible interpretation of sovereignty. Things are not either or. They're not mutually exclusive in many ways. Australia's approach to, for instance, shipbuilding, to nuclear deterrence, to force posture, to having foreign soldiers in your country is much more flexible and open to negotiation than it is in places like Korea or other US allies. So this is just a great painting from a Tasmanian artist, which is about the bandicoot's dilemma. So it's sort of how do you survive between all the cows and the ducks and the sheep to get through this world. So right now Australia has a vibrant debate domestically about what it is that Australia will do to secure itself in this very hostile, changing environment of the 2020s. And so many distinguished experts and scholars have written fantastic books. My point would be, if you change some of the words, a lot of this would be about the Korean experience today. How does Korea defend itself? How does Korea become an island or part of the peninsula? What happens after America? What happens to the Indo-Pacific? How will Korea deal with abandonment or the fear of abandonment? So I think many of these titles could easily relate to Korea. In conclusion, I think the dilemmas that Australia faces, most, not all, but most, do apply to Korea. So how to deal with US-China rivalry, right? It's how to be more proactive, more forward-leaning, as we would say in Australia. In terms of balancing values and interests, the biggest, I guess, difference between Korea and Australia is that a lot of what was made possible in my presentation today was because there was a very strong bipartisan consensus between the Liberal Party and the Labor Party. How do you maximize influence, right? To become the partner of first choice. How do you move beyond a transactional or mercantilist approach? How do you have a new identity? For Korea, that's going to be one of the great challenges for the next 10 to 20 years, right? How do you do self-reliance? Beyond, I guess, a very fixated idea or definition, right, of doing everything by yourself. So I think some of these are universal. They don't apply just to Australia, they apply to Korea, but many other US allies in our region on how they deal with the world. So for Korean scholars or ex-scholars of Korea, it actually is useful to not just look at the Korea-US alliance or the US-Japan alliance, but I think the time has come now to look at the US-Australia alliance, US-Philippine alliance, how the US deals with New Zealand, right, or with Canada. Because there are going to be lessons that other allies will learn from each other in the next years to come. So with that, thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Thanks very much for that, Peter. Now, I don't want to take up too much time with my own questions, so I've got a question which I'll put to you, but we'll only get to it if we have time, so, otherwise I'll open up to everyone else. So while I'm speaking, have a little bit of a think about what questions you'd like to put to Peter. But I realised actually when I introduced you that I forgot to say that you're also a non-resident fellow at the US Studies Centre at the University of Sydney, and so that you continue to work while you're at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies in that role as well. And I was reading, so there was a report that Peter co-authored recently that was put out through the US Studies Centre, which was called Allied Extended Deterrence. And so you were talking in that report basically about the importance of greater quadrilateral dialogue between US, Japan, Australia and Korea. And so I thought maybe you could just talk us through, if we've got time, how you think that would work, why, some of the mechanics of that recommendation. But as I said, let's put this to other questions now. So does anyone else have questions to put to Peter about Australia, or about the kind of how some of those ideas that he's been talking about might work in a Korean context?
First of all, thank you so much, Dr. Lee, for the fascinating presentation. As an Indonesian, the neighboring country, to hear about this, it's really fascinating to get a Australian perspective in the security alliance. And our second question mentioned, we cannot not mention about the current election in the discussion of the alliance. As you know, currently, Prime Minister Albanese back to the office again, and he just visited Indonesia a few days ago. And while South Korea, on the other hand, will going to have election, and seems like the Democratic Party will predicted to be winning the election. So with this, I'm going to ask about the implication for this for Australia, whether since the Democratic Party will go back to the office in South Korea, what this is for Australia, and especially against U.S. with Trump, Conservative Party that antagonizing their allies, especially with the war terrain. So this is what's the implication for Australia?
Yes. Okay, well, we might go straight to that answer, I think. So if you've got other questions, hold that and I'll put them to you shortly.
Yeah. I'll come back to the extended deterrence one second. I won't speculate on Korean domestic politics. I don't think that's sort of my role at the moment. I would say there is quite a lot of bipartisan consensus in Korea, actually, about how to deal with many of its regional partners. So I put it that way. Korea, regardless of who's in power here, it sees Australia as an important strategic partner. And that's for key, I guess, functional reasons, whether that's trade, whether that's defense industrial cooperation, whether that's renewable energy, whether that's as Australia as an alliance partner, right? So I think regardless of who is in power in Seoul, there is a commitment to that. I think actually if you take the Indonesian case, there is a bipartisan consensus in Korea about how to deal with Indonesia. It's because there are some, I guess, linkages that countries have in our region that go far beyond the preferences of any single leader. I think that's sort of where I'd leave that point. But the point on Trump is quite important though, right? Because we've seen that over the last few months since he was elected and since he's been inaugurated, most of the key US allies have been very quick to go to Washington, right? Two that have not gone are from South Korea and Australia. So the British have gone, the Japanese have gone, the Canadians have gone, India's gone, but quite a few of our regional leaders have not gone yet. So I think, there is the clock is ticking certainly in terms of the tariff deadline, but I would expect that both leaders would go within the next month or two once these elections are concluded. And they would, I think, pitch very heavily around, they would take a different approach, I think. What I've observed the most is that the European leaders have been much more vocal, much more committed to taking a strong, I use quotes, strong stand or retaliatory stand. Most of the leaders in our region have not done that. And so you can debate why. Why Prime Minister Ishiba has not been as hard leaning or pushing back. I think we recognize that we have to deal with the United States regardless of who's in power. And so having a hostile relationship with the United States will not be in Australia's interest or Korea's interest, or perhaps even Indonesia's interest. On the extended deterrence component, so what I was trying to get at in my presentation was Australia sits very differently compared to Japan and South Korea in that debate around deterrence. One, nobody's threatening to nuke Australia. So there is no nuclear neighbor that's saying we're going to bomb Australia and put a sea of fire over Sydney, right? So Australia has a very sort of privileged position. And yet Australia realizes that the nuclear threats now are all interlinked, right? So Australia watched with very grave concern when Russia was moving tactical nuclear weapons into Belarus. Because that says, countries like Russia or China or North Korea are willing to use nuclear threats in a fundamentally provocative way that they have not done so since the Cold War. So even though Australia is not a direct threat, even though Australia doesn't need nuclear weapons in any way, Australia really recognizes that the broader alliance system on which the credibility of US deterrence relies, that needs to be upheld. I think that's where Australian experts and officials are saying, well, we want to support Japan and Korea in terms of what they need to feel more confident in US deterrence. Because if that falls, then that opens the door to, I guess, many potential scenarios in which Korea and Japan have much more audacious nuclear options, I think.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Dr. Lee. My name is Dr. Joe, and I'm an alumni of GSIS. And as Australia is placing a lot of effort in their security in the Indo-Pacific region, on the other hand, I was wondering what are the policymakers in Australia's stance and their perspectives on their geo-economic strategies, since like China and Australia's economies are interconnected and they're members of ASEAN. I was wondering how they're balancing the geopolitical and geo-economic stance together.
Yeah, it's a really important question. So if you look at the Australia-US alliance, one of the big points of friction for many years was that American policymakers wanted Australia to take a much more stronger stance against Chinese economic influence, against Chinese economic dependence. So if you go back about a decade ago, Australia signed a free trade agreement with China, 2014, 2015. That was around the same time that Australia did it with Japan and Korea as well. They did 3 FTAs. That was the period when Australia-China relations were quite good. Australia welcomed Chinese investment in ports, in agriculture, in terms of housing. So Australia had a very color-blind, country-blind policy. And that position has stayed relatively consistent even today. So even as US-China relations have gone very bad, as the American policymakers have said, you need to decouple from China, you need to screen out all Chinese investment, Chinese interference, Australian government positions on both sides has been, well, that is a matter for the regulators, that is a matter for review boards, it's not a government decision to make. So a good example is the Port of Darwin. So it's that port that, in the city of Darwin, the northernmost city, that was sold to a Chinese company. That also happens to be the city where the US Marines come every year, right? It's going to be a huge, I guess, location touch point for Australia-US Defense Cooperation. So the Americans are very clear that they're not comfortable with a Chinese company owning the port and all of the infrastructure around the port. Despite that, there were a few official government politicians who said, well, we need to revisit that, we need to cancel that deal. Even now, that deal is still in place. So that tells you a little about Australia's approach to China and economic statecraft more generally, which is it's been able to sort of separate those two issues. Whether Australia can continue to do that is an open question. But generally, I think Australia takes a different position to the United States when it comes to free trade, when it comes to investment. So Australia, for instance, is still a part of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is the Chinese AIIB. The Americans have wanted Australia to get out of that for a long time. Also Korea. But Australia and Korea remain part of AIIB, a lot of RCEP, a lot of regional economic tools that, for instance, the US and Japan have walked away from or never joined. So that tells you that there is still scope for countries like Australia or Korea to find their own path. They don't have to do everything that the United States says.
Thank you, Professor. My name is Juno Kang. I'm an exchange student in the GSIS from the University of Tokyo. And one personal question and the question based on your lecture, like the personal one is like why have you chose your specialty in the Korea-US, Australia-US relation? While you're being Korean, you could have chosen the Australian-Korean relation, and you're in broad spectrum in Asian, so like Southeast Asian and Australia, like Indonesian, so it makes sense. That's my personal view.
Yeah.
And about the lecture, like at your summary part, I heard like Australia is like a flexible interpretation of defense, which is a good thing and makes sense. But if it goes like too extreme, like it may run into the securitization of everything. I heard this from the professor she's class personally. And how is Australia is balancing but the flexibility does need, like definitely nowadays security is not only about the military or the nuclear traditional thing. So while having this flexibility, how is Australia managing that it is not going too extreme? Maybe the Darwin port that you just mentioned is one example. If there are any other examples or under your understanding, I'd like to know that. Thank you very much.
No, it's a great question. The first one is, so I did my PhD on Australia-Korea relations. So I did that as the thing that I always wanted to answer. And then I said, I've done that, I'll go do something else. So I went off and did Australia-US relations. I said, I've done that. I'll come here and I'll figure out Korea-US relations. So now I'll figure out the triangle. And then we'll keep expanding after that. I think it's do what you're interested in. So if you want to do Korea-Japan, do Korea-Japan. If you want to do Korea, I'm actually working with someone who does Korea, New Zealand. You can do whatever you want. That's the driving logic. The question around flexibility, I think what I was trying to point out is it's flexibility in terms of how you think about sovereignty. So not flexibility in terms of substance. It's how much do you want to be fixated on a sovereign, full control, full production, full domestic capability, right? And so this is one of the things I've noticed a lot about Korean debates around security. And it's part of Korean history, Korea's journey that Korea came from, right? The question of sovereignty and operational control, for instance. So there are people in Korea who are very fixated on operational control of the Korea-US military. And that comes from a very unique experience where they didn't have control, so now they want full control, right? An Australian interpretation would say it's not an either or. You can have shades of control, you can have shades of sovereignty, you can pool sovereignty with other countries, right? You can share sovereignty over certain issues. It doesn't have to be a full 자주국방 North Korean style, we have to do everything at home, we can't have any reliance on a single country. That is the extreme conclusion of a fixation on sovereignty. I'm saying the Australian case says it can be much more elastic, flexible, and dynamic. I think, and to give you another example, so when the AUKUS partnership was announced in 2021, nobody sort of had known that this was coming, right? It was really shocking that Australia would get nuclear-powered submarines. The very next day, the Prime Minister said, yes, we'll get these nuclear-powered submarines with the United States, but they will be built in Australia, we will never get nuclear weapons, and he added a whole list of conditions around things that he thought were not uncompromisable or non-negotiable. And that, I think, is reflective of that Australian approach to say, we will go down this path, but we will add all of these conditions, we will change the terms around this to suit our own national interests. So I think that is perhaps the most useful lesson from the Australian experience as Korea deals with a more flexible relationship with other countries. So Korea is going to have new partnerships, quasi-alliances, comprehensive strategic partnerships with other countries beyond the United States in the years to come. That will include Australia. It will include Canada, the Philippines, and other countries, and potentially down the road, something more productive with Japan. But in all of those relationships, I think there will be people in Korea who will say, no, this is dangerous. We can't do anything with Australia. We can't have a SOFA. We can't have a visiting forces agreement. because it's an infringement on sovereignty. And my argument would be, the Australian history says you can do stuff with the Philippines or with Singapore and life will go on, right? You can have flexible cooperation, partnerships and exchanges with countries. They don't diminish your sovereignty in any way. I think that's the big takeaway for me.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Lee. I think we've run out of time, so I'm going to ask everyone just to thank you. And they were really, I learned a lot, so I hope that the rest of you did there as well. So thanks very much.
Thank you.